For 2 years, I always thought Charles came from a poor family. Until I raised money for his sick sister and fell off the stage. From then on, she could no longer dance. He recovered his identity as a wealthy young master, covered the entire city with roses, and proposed to me. I just wanted to test if you could love me under any circumstances. Congratulations, you passed my test. On our 3rd year of marriage, Charles cornered me in his archenemy at the bedroom door. His eyes were almost bloodshot as he asked, "Why?" "I just wanted to test if you could love me under any circumstances." I pulled up my nightgown to cover the fresh kiss marks and sadly said, "You didn't pass my test." On our 3rd wedding anniversary, Charles's sister Vivian was causing trouble again, wanting to be discharged from the hospital. She asked me to pick her up. After hanging up the phone, Charles looked at me and told me to attend to the guests first, he would be back soon. I nodded and said, very understandingly, "No need to rush, Vivian leaving the hospital is the priority, let's take care of that first." "Stella," he slightly emphasized my name, showing some dissatisfaction. "Today is our anniversary. So, please hurry back." Finally, Charles left satisfied. Once he was gone, the guests couldn't help but show their contemptuous looks towards me. Is she the one that Charles made a grand proposal to? She doesn't seem very favored. Embarrassing, she can't even keep her husband on their anniversary. Look at her legs, all scarred, can barely walk straight, what's the difference from being disabled? Whispers reached my ears. I pretended not to hear, walked up on stage, and politely announced, "There are some urgent matters at home, so let's end the banquet here for today." As expected, it wasn't until a long time after I repeatedly sent the guests away, and the banquet was over. Charles finally returned with Vivian. Both of them had strange expressions on their faces. Charles looked cold and grim, Vivian had a lingering blush on her face. I asked, "What happened?" He gritted his teeth and said, "We ran into that Robert on the way back, such a haunting presence." I knew Robert was 2 years younger than him and was called a teenage genius when he was young, always outshining him. Later, he entered the family business and snatched several major projects from Charles. He has always been considered his archenemy. Subconsciously, I raised my hand and touched the tiny wound at the corner of my lips. Thankfully, the bleeding had stopped. "Charles, why are you treating me like this when you know I like him?" Vivian arrogantly lifted her chin and said, "Maybe, he knew I was getting discharged today and deliberately waited on the way to create a chance encounter." Charles coldly said, "If he really likes you, why would he keep snatching our company's deals multiple times?" In the past 6 months, our original market share has been eroded by 30%, all because of his mischief behind the scenes. "Charles," Vivian dragged his tone, clinging to his arm and acting cute, "how about this? When I'm with Robert, I can make him hand over all their company's projects to us, okay?" I sat silently on the side, listening to their conversation without speaking. However, my mind inexplicably went back to a moment earlier. After sending off the last guest, I returned to the bedroom. As I was closing the door, someone grabbed my shoulder and pushed me against the door. Then, another hand reached out, holding my chin, forcing me to turn my head to meet his urgent and scorching kiss. "I've been waiting for you," Robert murmured between my lips, his voice slightly hoarse. This kiss felt more like a punishment, nibbling with a bit of skin abrasion, the slight sting making desire surge even more intensely. A scorching body temperature rubbed against my waist, and I raised my hand to cup his face, returning the firm biting with even more force. "Hurry up," I whispered softly, "he'll be back soon." "I'm sorry, it's not getting up so fast," Robert insincerely apologized, his actions becoming more fierce. He even had the leisure to tuck my stray hair behind my ear. I bit my lip uneasily, only managing to remind him, "Don't leave marks, they will be seen," before being dragged into the endless waves of passion. Robert nipped at my shoulder, muttering disapprovingly, "That's not what you said when you hooked me in the first place." At this point, I subconsciously twitched my lips. Suddenly, Vivian looked at me, "Why are you smiling? Do you find what I said amusing? Or do you think I shouldn't be discharged today, delaying your spotlight at the banquet?" "I don't," I gently furrowed my brows, but before I could finish speaking, she turned pale and clutched her chest, collapsing on the sofa, starting to breathe rapidly. That's enough. Charles stood up, sternly reprimanding, Stella, it was my decision to go pick up Vivian from the hospital. If you have any dissatisfaction, direct it at me. Why were you deliberately making it difficult for her, knowing Vivian has a heart condition? Now, apologize to Vivian. I looked at the suppressed anger in Charles's eyes. Somehow, I thought of something from before we got married. During our courtship, I didn't know Charles's true identity. I thought he was just a very ordinary, poor student. He also had a sister with a congenital heart disease who spent most of her time in the hospital. I was afraid that his scholarship money was all going to the hospital, causing financial difficulties in Lefeso. I took on an extra job and dragged him to the cafeteria at mealtimes. He stared at the food tray with a slightly furrowed brow. I thought he felt guilty and comforted him, saying, "You're my boyfriend, the money I earn should be spent on you. Don't feel too much pressure." After graduation, Vivian also recovered and left the hospital. We found a bigger house to live in together. "You're such a good student, you'll definitely find a good job." As I was speaking, Charles suddenly grabbed my hand, and hesitated. "A suitable heart has been found for Vivian, but we don't have enough money for the operation." "How much more do we need?" 300,000. He looked at me firmly, emotions swirling in his eyes. "Stella, what should I do?" The hand that was holding mine felt cold and uncertain. I squeezed it tighter. "Don't worry, I'll figure something out." For the next period of time, I worked part-time and took on acting gigs like crazy. All the money I earned, except for basic living expenses, went straight into Charles's account. On my 21st birthday, I received a well-paid commercial performance gig. Perhaps due to the exhaustion from non-stop work, I developed a low-grade fever on the day of the show. In a moment of carelessness, I fell off the stage. The sharp edge of the metal frame cut into my muscles and pierced my shin bone. The excruciating pain made me faint instantly. When I woke up, I was in a private hospital room, the most high-end single room. I couldn't open my eyes yet, but my hearing caught snippets of a conversation outside. "What's the big deal? 30,000 isn't even enough to buy Charles a piece of clothing. Why did he have to lie like this? Now look, her leg is permanently damaged, she won't be able to dance again." Then, Charles sounded a bit agitated. I didn't expect it to turn out like this. I opened my mouth, a tear falling down. Charles, he heard the sound, turned his head sharply, and looked at me. "Why?" Charles lowered his gaze to me, only saying, "Stella, I will make it up to you." The day I left the hospital, I was still in a wheelchair. He covered the city in roses, grandly proposing to me. "I just wanted to test if you could love me under any circumstances." "Stella, congratulations, you passed my test." Charles, dressed in a designer suit, holding a large bouquet of flowers, took steps towards me. "Now, let's get married." Snapping back to reality, I didn't say anything. I just lifted my skirt, revealing the gruesome scar on my leg from the fall I took to save your sister. Charles frowned. "Are you bringing up these past events now? Do I need you to rescue me?" Vivian, sitting on the sofa opposite, sneered. "Who knows if you're just pretending to be pitiful? Trading a scar for a chance to marry into our wealthy family, sounds like a good deal, right?" I looked at Charles. "Is that what you think too?" He turned his head slightly, avoiding my gaze. "Vivian is just a child, Stella, stop being so calculating with her." The atmosphere became tense. I closed my eyes, stood up, and silently walked upstairs. Vivian's dissatisfied voice echoed behind me. "Brother, look at her attitude. Does she really think I owe her something? Serves her right." Back in the bedroom, I looked around, checked everything carefully to make sure Robert had left without leaving any clues. Then I turned to take a shower. When I came out of the bathroom, Charles was already back in the bedroom, standing in front of the dressing table with his back to me. As he heard movement, he turned abruptly. I saw him holding a very familiar blue diamond necklace. It was the gift Robert gave me before he left. At that time, he leaned against the dressing table, fiddling with the clasp with his fingertips, saw it at the auction, thought it would suit you, so I bid on it. I couldn't help but laugh, cheating and commemorating Charles, huh? What cheating? You make it sound so bad. It's called turning over a new leaf, bravely chasing love. Robert walked away like a proud little puppy tail. Besides, gifts represent good wishes. I wish myself an early promotion. After saying that, he walked over, kissed my forehead, and left without looking back. These memories flashed rapidly in my mind for just a second. I ran my fingers through my hair and met Stella's dark gaze. It seemed like just last month when Robert won that necklace at the auction in Hong Kong. He lifted the chain, the blue diamond pendant swaying in the air, shimmering. Stella, why is it here with you? Countless thoughts raced through my mind, quickly deducing the most likely scenario. Why? I looked at him expressionless. I thought you would be very clear about the reason. Anger flashed in Charles's eyes momentarily as he strode over to me, his voice deepening. What reason should I know? When you promised to come back soon before you left, but I never saw you again. I looked straight at him, waiting to say goodbye to all the guests, and bumped into Robert at the door. But you didn't come back. He threw this necklace at me, saying that last month at the auction, you intended to bid on it as an anniversary gift for me, but he beat you to it. He remarked, too bad, seems like Stella isn't that valuable in your husband's eyes, huh? Still, you didn't return. By the time he finished speaking, my voice trembled slightly and tears welled up in my eyes, but I kept staring into Charles's eyes. In the end, it was he who looked away first. Moments later, he resumed his usual indifference. So, did you accept it? I chuckled, firing back, it's expensive, why wouldn't I accept it? Stella, our family hasn't degraded to this point because of you. Charles grabbed my chin, glaring at me with clenched teeth. It's not 3 years ago anymore. You are my wife, not that poor student who had to dance around to make ends meet. Don't be so disgraceful. There's a business banquet next month. You and I will attend together, and Robert will be there too. When the time comes, you can throw this necklace in his face and tell him, I don't need anyone else to give my wife an anniversary gift. As he finished his last few words, his tone intensified, and he flung his hand that was holding my chin to the side. Along with the necklace, I stumbled and fell onto the nearby bed, hitting my ankle on the bed frame, scraping off a large patch of skin. The sharp pain left my mind blank in an instant. You. Charles's gaze lowered, landing on my bleeding ankle, then he opened his mouth. He seemed to want to say something, but stopped after uttering a single word, slammed the door in lingering anger. I stared at the glaring light on the ceiling, my vision blurred. In a daze, it felt like 5 years ago. The young man in a washed-out denim jacket, holding textbooks, nervously confessing his feelings to me. He would walk through half the city in the rain with an umbrella to pick me up, sit in the audience watching my performance intently. He would buy a 4-figure value dance dress for me, and when I hesitated about returning it, he hugged me and said, "Don't return it, you look beautiful in it. Stella, you deserve the best." But that price couldn't even compare to the tips he casually handed to the waiter at the gala. It was all fake from the beginning. It was all lies. After the throbbing pain subsided, I slowly sat up from the bed, changed clothes, and went downstairs. The living room was empty. Charles and Vivian were nowhere to be seen. Expressionless, I crossed the yard, got a cab to the hospital. The doctor used tweezers to hold the iodine-soaked cotton ball, tending to my wound. This area seems to have been seriously injured before. How did you manage to be so careless again? You hit the bone. Be careful walking for the next few days, or the injury might worsen, leading to more severe consequences. I softly replied. After tending to the wound, I got up, left the room, opened the door, and accidentally bumped into someone. Instinctively, I staggered back a step. The next second, my waist was embraced by someone. Stella? Robert's gaze shifted to me, and when he saw the wound on my ankle, his eyes darkened momentarily. Was this done by Charles? I steadied myself, wriggled out of his embrace. Do you have business at the hospital? If not, I won't disturb you. I'll head home first, with a very formal and unfamiliar tone. I left through the door, and Robert silently followed behind me, traversing the long corridor of the hospital and entering the elevator in the underground parking lot on the basement level. I finally sat in the car, but Robert grabbed my hand. "What's going on?" I pushed the stray strands of hair behind my ear and smiled. "Nothing much, just that the necklace you gave me was discovered by him." He questioned me, and I gave him a flimsy excuse that you looked down on him, which made him angry, but I wasn't wrong since you already looked down on him. Robert looked at me, pursed his lips, a hint of guilt in his eyes. "It's my fault," he said. "I shouldn't have been impulsive and provoked him with those words, causing him to take it out on you today." I lowered my eyes slightly, speaking calmly. "Next month, I've sent the baseline and core plan of Charles's company's bid, as well as the third batch of personnel list that can be targeted, to your email. Robert, I don't want to wait anymore." As I finished the last few words, there was a subtle hint of trembling in my voice. After a few seconds of silence, I added, "And, I don't want to go home tonight either." Before the words could fully sink in, I saw a sudden darkening of his expression. Robert reached out to pull me closer, placing me on his lap. The car lights dimmed, his beautiful eyes were inches away, gazing at me. As our bodies touched, the temperature rose, the rustle of fabric heightened the ambiguous atmosphere. I squinted, but what fell wasn't his kiss, it was his hand gently holding my ankle, avoiding the wound. "Does it hurt?" Robert asked quietly. It was strange for him to show concern like this. "It's fine, I've had worse," I replied. He suddenly apologized, and when I asked why, he moved closer, resting his chin on my shoulder. I tilted my head slightly, feeling his warm breath tickling my ear, creating a tingling sensation. The position we were in should have been very suggestive, and our bodies, pressed closely together, could clearly sense each other's emotional changes, but he seemed oblivious and just apologized for what he had said 2 years ago when we first met. Before I could reply, a sudden shuddering gasp interrupted his words. As I gripped him, moving slowly and calmly, I said softly, "There's no point bringing up the past now. Let's resolve this quickly and get back." "Stella," Robert refused to back down, holding onto my shoulders, sliding down, exerting force uncontrollably in the increasing tide of desire. The slight pain from his strength made me go along with his movements. As the clouds melted and drops fell, watering everything on the dry soil. At the moment the closed flower petals bloomed, I leaned forward and muttered, "You were right before, I'm just a cripple." Robert's eyes shot open suddenly. In those sharp eyes, there was regret, lingering desire, and even more deep, dark emotions all mingled together. Even in this moment, before he could finish his sentence, he closed his eyes, leaned in, and kissed me fiercely. "Don't worry, I'll speed things up," he assured me. The next morning, as I woke up to the brightening sky, my phone rang, waking me up. On the other end, Charles's voice came through, "Stella, throwing a tantrum has its limits. I accidentally hurt you, and you didn't come home. Were you deliberately trying to make me worry?" My drowsiness vanished instantly. I explained that I stayed in the hospital overnight due to an old injury being aggravated. There was a moment of silence on the phone. I gathered my thoughts and calmly said, "The doctor said it's a bone bruise, and some old injuries resurfaced, so I stayed in the hospital for a night." The phone went silent again. I rubbed my disheveled hair and was about to sit up when Robert's arm reached over. In the next moment, he rolled over, straddling my waist and slowly leaning in close within reach. He stared into my eyes. We both seemed to enjoy this frank and vulnerable gaze. It felt like as long as we kept this way, our hidden relationship wouldn't just be a mutual exploitation by two scheming individuals. "It's my fault, Stella. Which hospital are you at?" "I'll come see you now," Charles finally spoke again after a brief quiet spell on the phone. Out of nowhere, Robert flashed me a wicked smile and then lowered his furry head, moving inch by inch downwards. Spring grass grew wildly, dewdrops on the leaves, a small snake slithering through the grass. I took a couple of breaths uneasily, trying to push Robert away with my free hand, but he grabbed it, pressing it against my waist. No need. The doctor said I can be discharged soon. I have to go back to the hospital for a follow-up this afternoon. I'll hang up." The call ended, the phone slipped from my hand and landed among the scattered clothes on the floor. Robert. He finally raised his head, a slight smile playing on his lips, sunlight reflecting through the window with water streaks. Is honey upset? The seldom called nickname mixed with his intrusive gaze caused a primal sense of danger to stir in my heart. What are you up to? I asked warily. He gestured casually with his fingertips and smiled leisurely. Didn't your sister mention it on the phone? I'm helping you with your checkup. By the time everything settled down, it was already past noon. I hastily ate a few bites of lunch Robert made, preparing to leave. But he grabbed my hand once again. I wish today could be every day, he said. I picked up my bag, glancing at him. We'll meet at the banquet next month, and at the bidding meeting after that. What about before that? I sighed, feeling a bit helpless. From yesterday to today, I think you and I have had enough of each other. He stood his ground, almost glued to me with his gaze. So we won't see each other for a whole month? I hesitated before trying to reassure him. I'll figure something out and find time to see you. Perhaps as a way to make it up to me, even though the company's stock was falling and liquidity was tight, Charles still spent millions to buy a more expensive pink diamond necklace, personally putting it on my neck for our anniversary. On the day of the banquet in the second month, I arrived arm in arm with Charles, dressed up. In the center of the banquet hall, I immediately spotted Robert, chatting and laughing with some people. He was their family's most remarkable youngest son. Despite his young age, he excelled in the business world, with sharp instincts and bold tactics. In just 2 years at the company, he had doubled the business territory. Wherever he went, he was the center of attention in the crowd. Robert. Charles called out coldly and made his way through the crowd. He squeezed my hand slightly, and I tossed the blue diamond necklace in my hand towards Robert with swift precision. He caught the necklace as it swung through the air, cutting short the fleeting smile he had directed at me. Mr. Robert, the anniversary gift from my husband and me doesn't need your help. I said coldly. Really? Robert raised an eyebrow. That day at the auction, Charles and I were bidding for this necklace. I thought Ms. Stella would like it. I don't care for the necklace. It's a gift from my husband, anything is fine. I stared at him. This is something between my husband and me, which you probably wouldn't understand. So, please don't bother. The atmosphere became tense for a moment. The person next to us sensed something was wrong and quickly tried to defuse the situation. Robert and Charles are going to be family soon. Why are they at odds with each other? I was stunned. Brother-in-law? Yeah, isn't Robert about to get engaged to Charles's sister? They'll be family soon, why all this animosity? I didn't hear the rest of the words. Charles let out a cold sneer, then took my arm and walked away. After a few rounds of drinks, he engaged in conversation with others while I went to touch up my makeup. As I passed a door at the end of the corridor, a hand suddenly pulled me inside. The room was dark, with only a faint moonlight coming in through the window. Aren't you afraid? Robert, guided by that faint light, found my lips and kissed me, teasingly wondering if he should be worried that I might be a bad person. I leaned my neck back against the cold door, feeling his increasingly hot body pressed against mine. Besides you, who else is this daring? Robert chuckled lightly as his lips moved down. Are you not bold? Back then at dinner, you dared to touch my leg in front of your husband, and now you say it's just between you and your husband. Your husband likes whatever gifts you receive. Does he know about us? I sensed that Robert's mood seemed off. So, I reached out to touch his cheek, trying to calm him. Are you angry? But I already told you about today's events. He brushed aside my scattered hair and bit my neck. The sharp pain came, and the next second, he let go of me and switched on the light. In an instant, the makeup room was brightly lit. Robert looked at me coldly and said, "Seems like you have nothing to ask me." With that, he opened the door and left without a backward glance. Alone in the room, I took a deep breath and then applied my lipstick. Calmly, I turned and left the room. By the time the party ended late at night, I returned to the hotel with Charles. Stepping into the elevator, I pressed the floor button in the mirror of the elevator. He suddenly turned his head and his gaze froze on the side of my neck. Stella. Charles suddenly turned around, grabbed my left wrist, and sternly asked, "What's this on your neck?" I thought of the bite from Robert and suddenly realized. Charles stared at me intently, his overwhelming anger and disbelief distorting his face slightly, almost terrifying. I instinctively moved back, and then almost felt my jaw being crushed as he held it tightly and pushed it up. His other hand pressed the bite mark with his fingertips, rubbing it forcefully until fresh blood welled up. The intense pain caused a slight ringing in my ears. "We've been married for 3 years. How much have I given you, and you dare to do this behind my back? Tell me, who is it? You don't have to say, I will find him tonight and tear him to pieces." My mind raced, my mouth opened to speak, but the elevator stopped. The door opened, and Robert was standing outside, perhaps not wanting to lose face in front of him. Charles finally released his grip on my jaw. But he still held my wrist firmly and dragged me to the room. "We'll talk about this later," he said. As we passed by, I lowered my eyes, avoiding the overwhelming emotions in Robert's eyes that were almost overflowing. The next moment, he suddenly reached out and stopped Charles. "Why go back to talk? Weren't you just looking for me to tear me to pieces?" Charles stood frozen in place. The force in his hand relaxed. Seizing the moment, I finally pulled my wrist from his grasp. He realized and looked at me in disbelief as I walked step by step to Robert's side. "Stella, what are you doing? Weren't you questioning me about the adulterer?" I looked at him calmly and said, "Honestly, I was planning to keep it a secret a little longer, but since it's out now, let's just leave it at that." "What does that mean?" "It means just what you saw," Robert said impatiently as he reached out and pulled me close to him. "Charles, you've never had a chance against me in the past. The necklace I casually gave Stella to wear? So what if I took it back? Do you really think you can anger me? Next time, I'll give her an even more expensive one. Wasn't it that you wanted to find me and tear me to pieces? How come now you can't speak? Step aside, we're going back to rest." Robert's last sentence was full of contempt and provocation. "Robert." Charles was so stirred up that his eyes were red, and suddenly he shouted and threw a punch at Robert's face. Robert dodged and pushed me to the side, and they started fighting. The scuffle lasted only half a minute before the hotel security personnel forcibly separated them. Neither family wanted to offend them, so they tried to persuade them politely and then quickly left. When no one else was around, Robert immediately came over, pressing his body against mine, showing me the bruise on his cheek. "Stella, it hurts. Even if I'm disfigured, will you still want me?" Charles, with his tendency to resort to violence at the drop of a hat, completely ignored Robert's sarcastic tone and just stared at me intensely. His eyes were so red they looked like they were about to bleed as he questioned, "Why? Why?" In that moment, I had an urge to burst out laughing at those words, those 3 words. 3 years ago, when I woke up from the hospital bed, I had asked him the same tearful question. How did he respond back then? "I just wanted to test if you could love me under any circumstances." I adjusted my messy hair, covering up the bright red kiss mark on my neck. "Unfortunately, you didn't pass my test." The emotions between Charles and I always seemed to balance out. The more one of us became hysterical, the calmer the other would be. When I found out I could no longer dance, I was in denial for a long time. It wasn't until after I was discharged and could barely walk from my wheelchair that I tried going to the dance studio. I tried over and over again, only to fall down repeatedly. In the end, I was covered in bruises, crying on the floor. That's when Charles walked in. He stood in front of me, looking down at me as I cried, unresponsive to my almost blood-curdling questions. Not a single word until I cried myself hoarse and exhausted, then he simply said, "Let's go home." The wedding gown had been made and sent over, so I went back to try it on. Since reclaiming his status as a wealthy heir and no longer needing to pretend to be a struggling student in front of me, he had become almost a stranger to me. Cold, arrogant, aloof. He couldn't understand why, now that he was willing to marry me and let me, a poor student who relied on dancing for a living, lead the life of a wealthy lady, what else could I possibly be dissatisfied with? As I tried on the wedding dress and had lost a bit of weight, the gown made for my size 2 months prior now hung on me, empty. The diamonds on the full skirt reflected the light brightly, highlighting the bruises on my arms even more starkly. Charles stood beside me, looking at our reflections side by side in the mirror. "Without a doubt," he said, "if you can't dance, then don't. After we're married, I'll arrange a position for you in the company. Stella, I can provide for you." I snapped out of my memories, looking at Charles in front of me. Anger and confusion rose in his eyes, intertwining and slowly turning into a poignant despair. "You can't do this," he said hoarsely. "Stella, I really do like you. From the start, I wanted to marry you." "What, Charles? Do you think you're a god descended from heaven? Is your affection so valuable?" Robert scoffed. 2 years into the marriage, Stella chose me, which means you have no charm at all. Instead of questioning her, maybe you should reflect on yourself, maybe you're just too useless and can't compare to me at all. With those words spoken, he once again put his arm around my shoulder and led me away. This time, Charles didn't try to stop us. He just stood behind us, saying, "Robert, you're seducing Stella just to beat me at this, right? Who congratulated me on picking a cripple to marry in the end? Stella, you may hate me, but is Robert any better?" His voice sounded almost as if it were bleeding. Robert tightened his grip on my shoulder. I, however, never stopped or turned back. As soon as we returned to the room, Robert let go of my shoulder. In the warm yellow light of the hallway, he lowered his head slightly, locking eyes with me. After a moment, I smiled. "Are you satisfied?" "Satisfied with what?" "I was wearing a formal dress today, with nothing to withhold. The mark you left, was it just to make Charles find out?" I tilted my head, moved my hair aside, revealing the dried bloodstain on my neck. "Tomorrow's tender offer meeting, this move is crucial. Provoking him tonight with this incident, causing him emotional instability, will likely lead to bigger problems. It's a strategic move indeed." Before I could finish my sentence, Robert interrupted me. "Is that what you were thinking? If not, then what?" I touched the wound on my neck. Even though I was mentally prepared, it still stung and trembled slightly. I put my hand down and walked towards the bedroom in the suite. I needed to find the medicine box to treat the wound. Suddenly, my body became weightless, and my voice trailed off abruptly. Robert unexpectedly lifted me up and took big strides into the bedroom. He placed me gently on the bed and then fetched the medicine box. He applied medicine to the wound on my neck and then lightly rubbed the skin next to it. "Does it hurt a lot?" Robert stared into my eyes and asked in a deep voice, "Stella, can you let me hurt the same way as you do?" I chuckled. "I'm not a puppy. I don't have a hobby of biting people like you do." "So, do you consider me your puppy?" He persisted, moving closer, and his warm breath brushed against my lips. "Will you always love your puppy?" I instinctively leaned back, lost my balance, and fell back on the bed. Robert's body naturally covered mine. This encounter was more urgent than any previous ones, like a spark falling on dry firewood and being fanned by the wind. In an instant, the flame spread, intense like a rising tide. But because we had been through this so many times, we were too familiar with each other's bodies. The slight discomfort quickly turned into more passionate desire. The clouds outside moved away, and the moonlight seemed to surge like waves of emotion. My thoughts were like seashore rocks, soon shattered by violent waves. Even the sounds I uttered became fragmented and incoherent as we soared to the sky. Robert suddenly pressed down on my waist, as if we were merging into a cloud. I could almost see a hint of resentment in his eyes. "You know better than anyone what I want to say," he muttered. "But it's okay. I can't always let you play dumb forever." I fell asleep drenched in sweat. Even my fingers were too weak to move. Perhaps it was because of the alcohol I had at the party that night. Time flowed backward in my dream, and I recalled 2 years ago. The first time I met Robert. At the grand banquet, Robert had a history of conflict with Charles. When he walked in holding my hand, he raised an eyebrow and joked, "Charles, everyone says you went to the slums to experience life and ended up marrying a cripple." His gaze fell on the hideous scars on my legs, then roamed up, finally meeting the gentle smile in my eyes. He seemed slightly taken aback. "Don't bother with my affairs," Charles coldly retorted. "I heard you just joined the company. Worry about yourself. Watch out for mistakes, otherwise your illegitimate brother will be brought back to his family to replace you." But during that period, their families had a brief cooperation. Despite their dislike for each other, they had to sit down at the same table for dinner. Robert casually chatted with his friends the whole time. Until under the table, my ankle brushed against his leg. He abruptly turned his head, looking at me incredulously. The 19-year-old youth blushed to the tips of his ears but didn't say anything. Late that night, in Robert's private villa car outside. On the back seat, our figures intertwined, and steam filled the air. "Stella, does Charles know what kind of person you are? Whether he knows or not, does it matter? Didn't you just slam the table and curse me for being promiscuous? Now you want to tell him?" Ignoring his words, I prepared myself, found the right position to sit, leaned down with a smile, and rubbed against his burning chest. "Since you and Charles clash, you should be begging for this, right?" Robert was taken aback and sucked in a breath, freezing in place the next second. I lowered my head thoughtfully. "You've never done this before?" "Shut up." He angrily straightened his torso, but defiantly stared into my eyes. "Did you do this to Charles before? Are you suggesting I seduced him?" I laughed. "Yes, I did. You're the second one, so I have more experience." Before I could finish my sentence, Robert passionately kissed me, cutting me off. This secret relationship continued into its third month. One night, after the wind had calmed and the waves had subsided, I leaned against the headboard, watching Robert kneeling between my legs, still unsatisfied. Suddenly he said, "You really hate Charles, don't you?" His movement stopped, and he looked at me with a hint of resentment. "Do you have to bring him up now? Isn't it all because of him that we can start?" I chuckled, ruffled his hair as a gesture of comfort, and then continued, "I have a big gift for you, how about that?" I knew Robert's desires and ambitions were far more than just controlling a family business. Charles is now the head of their company. If you cooperate with me, maybe the company's market value will shrink considerably, but in at most 3 years, I can make it yours. Robert remained silent, just staring at me. Gradually, the look of lustful puppy-like Robert who was clinging to me disappeared. In his place, stood the rumored ambitious and ruthless CEO. Robert stood up straight, propped up my knees, and mockingly said, "So, you contacted me from the beginning for this? Why? Do you hate Charles?" I laughed. "The first night we slept together, you already did a thorough investigation of me, so why ask now?" I suddenly opened my eyes. The faint light from the horizon came through the never tightly drawn curtains. Probably after several tumultuous nights, too tired, Robert was still sound asleep by my side. He had a strikingly handsome face, high cheekbones, pale lips, and a prominent nose that accentuated the contours of his face. But with his eyes closed, all that sharpness vanished. I turned my head and stared at his peaceful sleeping face. After a moment, I chuckled softly. My estimation was correct. Charles must have been restless all night. Coupled with Robert's understanding of the core of the company's project, which was the key to owning a significant market share in the next 3 years. Charles was already in a tight financial situation. The shares they had mortgaged before could now come in handy. As Robert and I chatted, we walked out of the elevator. We ran into Charles face to face. He looked haggard, bloodshot eyes. As soon as he saw me, he hurried over. "Stella." He gritted his teeth. "It was you who leaked the information, those employees. It was your doing, wasn't it?" "I don't understand what you're saying." I knew he had no solid evidence, so I quickly changed the subject and said, "I've had the divorce papers sent to you by the lawyer. I don't want anything. If you don't agree, then we'll go through the litigation process. But I advise you to sign it. You have more important things to do next. Being distracted by these trivial matters isn't worth it." Charles looked at me. In those eyes, there was a mixture of despair and more hatred. From the moment you agreed to marry me 3 years ago, you were planning for this day, weren't you? He said, I know your leg was injured, but I've compensated you, given you something you couldn't have had on your own for a lifetime. Why do you hate me so much? Were those 2 years we spent together all a lie? Charles, you're not a child anymore, can't you stop acting like a resentful husband? Robert sneered, holding my hand affectionately. You caused Stella's leg to be injured, making her unable to dance and walk normally forever. Can this kind of harm be fully compensated by marrying her? Who do you think you are? The last sentence was almost dripping with undisguised disgust and hostility. At this point, Charles's defeat was inevitable. This was all part of my plan from the beginning. I could have done without saying anything more to Charles. But at that moment, I looked into his eyes filled with despair, and with utmost clarity, I said, it's because those 2 years were real. I genuinely liked you, noticed your family's difficulties, and sincerely wanted to help you. I planned everything carefully about our future together, and then you told me it was all a test. Back then, you probably wanted to experience a life of living hand to mouth, right? Well, now I'm helping you out. I stared at his suddenly pale face and smiled. It serves him right for betraying someone's sincerity. Over the next few months, even though Charles traveled far and wide, even his retired father was left embarrassed as he had to beg around. Still, he couldn't salvage the company's decline. Instead, it led to his past crime of hiring someone to murder for a piece of land he wanted, landing him in prison. With Charles's company being such a big player, many people were eyeing their share. So, it was only natural that everything got divided among them, leaving nothing for Charles. Thanks to the groundwork we had laid 2 years prior, Robert ended up with the lion's share. I knew he must be busy, so I didn't reach out to him again. But that night, the doorbell suddenly rang. As I opened the door, I saw Robert standing outside, with a few raindrops still lingering on his hair. Did it rain outside? I asked, stepping aside to let him in. Come on in. He entered, sat on the couch, and looked at me. I chuckled. I heard last week your fiancée flagged someone down, begged you to help, and cried so hard her heart gave in and she ended up in the hospital. Didn't you have a heart even then? What fiancée? Vivian? Robert's face went cold. We have no relationship. She even cursed you. Now, if she's in the hospital waiting to die, she deserves it. Well, it's as if you've never cursed me. I raised an eyebrow and stayed quiet. Robert's gaze softened. After that day, you never returned to that house. There was no need to. Don't you want to take your things with you? He shrugged. I already have my documents with me. The rest isn't mine. Holding a glass of water, I took a sip of the still hot liquid. I came empty-handed. I'll leave empty-handed. I've had enough of your circle. It sickens me. I didn't finish what I had to say. After all, Robert was seated right in front of me. With Charles gone, fallen into his hands, he was now the most admired figure in the entire circle. I kept a shred of dignity and changed the subject. You've caught in the rain. Have some hot water. Ignoring my offer, he suddenly stood up, approached me, and kissed me without a word. The kiss was forceful, biting, wiping the traces of water from my lips, leaving a faint sweet taste of blood. Our tongues intertwined. Robert kissed deeper, then grabbed my shoulder, and we both fell onto the slightly narrow couch. It had been 2 months since we saw each other. The movements were a bit rusty, but after 2 years of working together, we quickly found our rhythm. Stella, Robert stormed into my world like a gust of wind, blowing everything away. The petals bloomed and fluttered, refusing to close for a long time. Gasping heavily, I clutched his neck, and the room blurred before my eyes. As the passion subsided, the room fell silent. I tucked my sweaty hair behind my ear, sat up slowly, and calmly said, "Tonight, consider it the last time." It was as if he hadn't heard me, as he slowly embraced my waist and nuzzled. "What would you like for breakfast tomorrow?" "I'll make it for you." "Let's end it here, Robert," I said firmly. He sat up abruptly, leaning forward, looking straight at me. Do we have to end it like this? I retorted, our partnership has concluded. Do we need any more reason to continue like this? His eyes reddened, a hint of resentment flickering in his gaze. What if I say I like you? The rain outside rattled against the window. The room fell silent for a few seconds, where one could hear a pin drop. Then, I smiled gently and looked at him calmly. So what? 4 people in your circle, is liking someone such a big deal? I genuinely liked Charles once and now, I am the one who has sent him to hell. The truth is, I actually really like dancing. I wiped my cheek and added, before I could earn a living through dancing, I liked it a lot. In my hometown, after the wheat harvest in late summer, the wheat field was a vast expanse of golden yellow. I would wear my patched coarse dress and dance from one end to the other. Dance was born to celebrate the joy of harvest. You probably haven't seen such a scene or understood someone like me. That's okay, I never expected to enter your circle. But why destroy it all, force me into it, and expect me to be grateful to you all? Robert's eyes reddened even more. That was Charles, not me. How different are you from him? I spoke softly. When we first met, didn't you also mock me with them, saying Charles didn't know what he was doing and ended up marrying me? It was the first time I saw genuine regret and anguish in someone's eyes. I'm sorry. Robert looked at me, tears streaming down his face. I was young and arrogant back then. I wanted to ruin everything for him because he and I didn't get along. But that's normal. I comforted him. If you hadn't said those things, I wouldn't have come to you, and we wouldn't have formed a business alliance. So, we are now even, and nobody owes anyone anything. I owe you, Stella. I can make it up to you. Robert, I cut him off. I am naturally cold-hearted. I only intend to give my heart once in this lifetime, and now that it's been used, it's gone. You're right. I played dumb because I couldn't reciprocate your feelings, but I didn't want it to affect our business. Now that we're done, I pushed him away and stood up. The light from the bedroom lit up, casting a soft glow on Robert's face as he looked up to me. That sharp-featured face softened in the light. I've booked my ticket, leaving in a couple of days. I've paid an extra month's rent, so if you want to stay here, it's up to you. I despise this place and don't want to spend another day here, I concluded. Robert's epilogue. Robert had always wondered when he fell in love with Stella. After much contemplation, he couldn't pinpoint an exact answer. She was like a tranquil stream, silently seeping in until he was fully immersed in her presence before he even noticed. His feelings for her grew with each passing day, as did his regret for their initial meeting. However, time always moves forward, never looking back. He dreamt hundreds of times of their first encounter, of stopping her in the hallway after she left his room in a sluggish manner, telling her to divorce Charles and come to him. But when he woke up, she lay sound asleep beside him, the room still filled with lingering ambiguity. Memories of their complicated relationship flooded Robert's mind, not the normal start he fantasized about. They got entangled right from the start, not because of love, attraction, or anything else, but because she hated Charles and he happened to be the opposite of Charles, capable of aiding her. On the day Charles fell, Stella was already gone from the city. Charles was taken away by the police for suspected financial crimes. Robert went to see him. Your sister is still lying in the hospital, and now she really doesn't have the money for surgery. Through the glass, Robert looked at him mockingly. 3 years ago, you used this excuse to deceive her into trouble, right? Now I've made your dream come true. Are you happy? Charles looked up at him. His face was pale, weary-looking, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. Vivian just liked you. If you hadn't promised to get engaged to her last time, she wouldn't have. Robert chuckled. Give her hope, then completely shatter it. Isn't that more interesting? I feel nauseous just looking at her. Do you really think I would marry her? When Robert found out that the reason Stella was injured in the first place was due to Vivian's suggestion, his disgust towards her reached its peak. Charles stared at him. Looking at his empty surroundings, he seemed to suddenly understand something and burst out laughing. Stella is not here. I'm sure she likes you, but she won't stay by your side. Robert, struck at his most vulnerable spot, felt a sharp pain spreading through the cracks. He stood up abruptly, unable to hide his surging anger and jealousy in his eyes any longer. He had never wanted to admit it, but had to admit it was true. He was insanely jealous of Charles. Because he was the only one Stella had truly cared for. This emotion peaked after Stella admitted it herself. Robert let out a heavy sigh, calming his emotions down. He looked down at Charles. So what? I'm still young. At least she's quite satisfied with my body. I have plenty of time to make her change her mind. Whether it's you or your sister lying half dead in the hospital, your lives end here. Stella's epilogue. Right after I got to school, I heard the teacher at the next desk say that someone anonymously donated an art building to the school. It has music rooms, art classrooms, and a whole floor of dance studios. She sighed. I saw the construction plans this morning and it feels like it's elevating our shabby school by a notch. Would someone be so kind to an ordinary high school like ours? I was stunned for a moment, but still politely smiled. Really? That's great. In the afternoon dance class, I was stretching with a few girls when they suddenly all looked behind me. I turned around and saw Robert. He seemed to have lost some weight, appearing taller and more intimidating. But his gaze towards me remained as focused and deep as ever. Robert, I hesitated for a moment before speaking first. Thank you for the building donation. He smirked. You guessed it was me. I nodded. Having received so much, it's also good to contribute to society. After saying this, I didn't look at him again, turning back to the class and urging everyone to continue dancing. Robert didn't seem to intend to linger, sitting silently in the corner. From that day on, he began to show up in the dance studio every day, still quiet, just watching me. Eventually, familiar students asked me, Stella, is the donor chasing after you? And a girl, probably with too many novels read, pulled my sleeve whispering, Stella, is it him who injured your legs? No, I sighed helplessly. Let's go practice dancing, I'll go talk to him. After class, when all the students had left, it was just me and Robert in the classroom. You've been away for so long, aren't you worried about issues at the company? He chuckled. I'm not a fool like Charles, unable to even find a trustworthy subordinate. If major problems could arise from being away for a month or two, the company wouldn't be where it is today. But what's the point of you stalling like this? He blinked. As long as I'm by your side, every second feels interesting. I furrowed my brows. You. I only managed to utter one word before my eyes started shaking violently. I was a few seconds late to react. It was an earthquake. The old classroom I was in had a massive wooden beam above that was swaying, then it snapped and fell. Vivian. Robert rushed over, shielding me underneath him. After 2 months, his familiar scent enveloped me once again. But this time, it was mixed with the smell of blood. I sat outside the emergency room, silently staring at the bright red light above the door. The nearby city experienced a 6 magnitude earthquake, reaching us, but it wasn't too serious. However, the old dance classroom, being quite old, surprisingly became the only building in the whole school that collapsed. I don't know how much time passed before the door of the emergency room opened. The doctor came out, removing his mask. The patient was out of danger but had a broken leg, needing hospitalization for observation. You should go handle the admission formalities, the doctor said to the family. I let out a sigh of relief and stood up. Robert woke up the next morning. The doctor said his leg was severely injured and there might be some lasting effects after recovery. He lay in bed, his face pale from blood loss, looking at me very obediently. It's okay. This way, I'll be just like you. I paused for a moment and continued, you got injured saving me, so until you're discharged, I'll come take care of you every day. If you're very busy, it's okay if you miss a day or two, he said with a hint of helplessness in his tone. I raised an eyebrow. What if I'm busy every day? Robert tensed up a bit, then after a few seconds, he said, just come see me for a moment every night, that's good too. Just kidding. I picked up a fruit knife and peeled an apple for him. The dance classroom collapsed, so until the building you donated is rebuilt, I shouldn't be too busy. Time flew by, and over a month passed. On the night before I left, I told Robert, the doctor says your leg is almost healed, so you should be discharged in a couple of days. I saw your secretary here the other day. Ask him to handle your discharge formalities and go home. Don't come looking for me anymore. As I turned to leave, there was a sudden dull thud behind me. I turned back abruptly to see Robert falling off the bed. He was in so much pain, his face extremely pale, but he still looked at me pitifully. Seems like the injury on my leg has worsened. It might trouble you again for some time. Are you doing this on purpose? I suddenly spoke up. When that beam fell, you could have avoided it, but you didn't dodge on purpose, right? Robert froze in place. I walked over, squatted in front of him, and looked into his eyes. Why? After a moment of silence, he spoke with a hoarse voice. Because I wanted to return it to you. I regretted it countless times, wishing time could turn back to when we first met. I never spoke ill of you or said hurtful things, but time can't be turned back. So, I returned the harm to you. Now we are the same. As he said these words, there was even a hint of a smile in his tone. I frowned. Robert, are you crazy? Something similar seemed to have been asked by my sister that night. He lifted his eyes. You like puppies, so I'll be a puppy. If you like craziness, I can be crazy too. I stayed silent, just staring at him. His leg wasn't fully healed yet, and now he had another fall, which should be very painful. I clearly saw a drop of cold sweat on his forehead, but his eyes looking at me were filled with bright laughter. My fingertips curled slightly, and it felt like his eyes had burned my heart. That wasn't really a memorable harm at all. You don't have to worry about it, I sighed, ultimately. From childhood to adulthood, especially in those years after marrying Charles, I've heard much harsher words. So, I've grown accustomed to it. There's no need to talk about giving back. The reason we can't be together was never because of that. I used all my strength to help Robert up from the ground. But my legs were unstable, and I ended up toppling onto the bed with him. The bed creaked sharply, making me twitch, and I instinctively tried to get up. But my back was held down. Our bodies pressed together, his heartbeat resonating with mine through the thin layers of clothing. Robert? His shoulder felt damp, and I suddenly realized that Robert was crying. I know you don't like me, but don't tell me that. Just let me hold on to some hope, can you, Stella? After a pause, as if he suddenly had a brilliant idea, his voice raised almost excitedly. Or maybe, those 2 years before, we were quite compatible in bed. At least you didn't dislike my body, right? You can treat me as a pet, or something else, like a humanoid massage. The rest of his words were interrupted by my kiss. It wasn't a long kiss, but it seemed to leave Robert speechless. He stared blankly at me for a while, unable to speak. I gently stroked his face with my fingertips, confirming, for now, can it be like it used to be? After a couple of seconds, as if realizing it, he almost eagerly nodded. Can you lie down now? I'll call the doctor to check your leg, okay? Okay. Robert reluctantly released my hand. I stood up, straightened out my messy clothes and hair, and walked towards the door. Moonlight poured in like water through the window, creating ripples on the floor. Even though I didn't turn back, I could feel Robert's gaze sticking to my back like a tangible presence. As I reached the door, he suddenly called out, Stella. You'll come to see me tomorrow and the day after, before I'm discharged, right? Yes. After I'm discharged, can I continue to come find you, like before? Yes. After a moment of silence, his voice suddenly lowered, almost choked up. I love you. I turned my head slightly. In the moonlight, his tear-filled eyes sparkled like a pitiful puppy. I curved my lips. I know.